Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first of three webinars we are going to be offering in the lead up to the Bishop's Climate Summit. I'm Jonathan Brake. I'm the Eco Missions and Creation Care Coordinator for the Western North Carolina Conference. And we are excited about the things that are going to happen this year that have to do with creation care and justice in Western North Carolina. And this is the first of many installments. I'll tell you more about those at the end of this webinar. But as we're getting started, what I'd like for you to do is in the chat box, if you would, begin by putting your name, church name, and city state in the chat box so we know where you're coming from. We have a few people from outside of North Carolina, so that's why we're asking for your city and state, but your name, your church name, and your city and state. Also, as you're doing that, a reminder that this is a webinar that's being recorded. And if your microphone is not muted, then any noises from the background will show up on the recording. So we ask that you keep your microphone on mute the whole time so that we don't have a loss of information when the speaker might not be heard because of background noise. Thank you for your help with that. I see a lot of folks coming in from all over North Carolina, and we're excited to have you with us for this first of three webinars. This one is going to be a fun webinar for us, I do believe. We're looking at the warming world and asking the question, what have we done? Maybe the good question in there is, how do we know what we have done? And what can we do now? What is our current reality and where do we go from here? And so we've got two presenters who are going to be sharing this information with us, and we're excited to see and hear from them here in a few moments. As people continue to enter the room, we are looking forward to inviting them in. And just a reminder, if you're just joining us, that we're asking that you mute your microphone so that we don't hear background noise on the recording. And to add in the chat box your name, your church name, and your city and state. In addition to that, throughout the presentation, if any questions come up, anything that you'd like to know more about, we ask you to write that in the chat box. We've got a full presentation today. And if we run right up to the end of the hour, we want to make sure that we've got the questions in there for you so that you can see and so we can see and respond to those either after the top of the hour. We'll stay online for those who can and answer some questions, or we might be able to offer that to you in text later as a follow-up. So for right now, mute your microphone in the chat box, your name, church name, city and state, and then throughout the whole program, if you would, put any notes, any thoughts, any items that you'd like to hear more about or questions that may come up into the chat box, and we will utilize those at the end of the hour and later in this ministry throughout the year. All right. People are going to continue to come on in, and as they do so, our IT folks are going to make sure that they are muted and they're joining us in the webinar. All right, now as we get started, I want to share with you some background theological understanding of where we're coming from in creation care and creation justice. I want you to think about the very first book of our Bible. When you look at Genesis chapter 1, we read what? In the beginning, God created. And there are two stories there. The first of those two stories talks about 6 days of creation. And you'll notice that humans don't have our own day of creation. We're actually created on the same day that all the other beasts and critters and things on the land are created, because we are a part of something larger than just ourselves. We are not necessarily that pinnacle of all creation, and we are not the ones who are supposed to run it all ourselves. We have a different role. So we move to the second story of creation we find in Genesis chapter 2 and 3. And what we find in the second story is that God reaches down and picks up some of the topsoil of the earth. And when God picks up that topsoil, it is where life is so abundant on this planet. Within just 1 teaspoon of really healthy topsoil today, you'll find millions and millions of living organisms. And so it's out of that life already there on the earth from creation that God then forms a human being And in the Hebrew, the human being's name is the word for human being is Adam. We call him Adam because we anglicize everything, but Adam is the first human being, human creature that God puts on the earth. And the earth, the soil from which Adam is formed, the word for that soil is Adamah. So out of the Adamah, God creates the Adam. We are one and the same substance with the life of this earth. And so then God gives us as human beings the responsibility to care for, to keep, to till, to watch over, to make sure that this earth is taken care of, not because we dominate it or because we are now in charge, but because the earth belongs to God. And again, we hear that message throughout Scripture that this earth belongs not to us. This earth belongs to God, and we simply are the trustees, the caretakers of that which belongs to God. Now, some of the things that I've learned about the connection we have with the earth is if you take that same teaspoonful of healthy soil, that topsoil, and you do a DNA analysis of that life and a DNA analysis of a human body, what we discover is that somewhere around 73% is the same DNA. And inside your body, if you know anything about a gut biome, you know that the only way we stay healthy is if the living organisms inside of us stay healthy. And so if we were in a sanctuary, I like to do this in a sanctuary where I say to folks, turn to your neighbor and say to them, hello, all y'all, because inside of you is all y'all. There's millions of creatures and critters that make up our own little personal ecosystem. And then we're connected to one another as a larger ecosystem and eventually planet-wide. And so out of this understanding from Scripture, from our theology, from our faith, we come to the next step of understanding what God has done. It's been said that the earth is the first book of God's message, God's word to us, the creation itself. And so reading that creation requires us to use lots of different tools. And one of those tools that we use is science. I'm excited for our two presenters today who come to us from a science background, who have been studying and learning and looking at God's message, God's word to us in creation. And they're going to help us make the connection between what's been going on with God's creation, how humanity has been caring for it or not, and what do we do next. So our first presenter is Dr. Joe Donahue, and you'll see the bio information for Joe in the chat box. You can read more about what he has done, but Joe is an earth keeper, a Global Ministries earth keeper, and a member of our annual conference creation care team. And he comes to us with so much knowledge and expertise and understanding, and will be presenting a workshop at the Bishop's Climate Summit in April, and other places. He's working with a lot of our churches on solar power installations and energy efficiencies. But today, Joe is here to help us see and understand from his long-term expertise in playing with rocks and figuring out what the crust of the earth tells us about where God shows up and how we are part of that. So I'm going to turn it over to Joe. And Joe, will you share with us what would we need to know as Christians trying to live out our faith here on this beautiful planet?
First thing I'm going to share is the screen, if I can. And let's see. How's that look, Jonathan?
That looks good. You got it.
Good. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Jonathan, and also Kim Richmond, who's out there in Zoom land, and Don Lewis for putting together Bishop Carter's Climate Summit coming up in April, and the 3 webinars. So this is the first of our webinars, and there's the title. And I've divided it into these 3 parts, really. So first part, what I'd like to do, being a geologist, is I'd like to look at human history in the perspective of geologic history. And then, can you see my cursor now, Jonathan?
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah, okay. And then look at some examples of how human activities have altered and accelerated the normal cycles that drive Earth's natural climate systems, and in many cases driven them out of equilibrium. And finally, maybe in a more positive light, we can highlight some of the efforts underway to mitigate the effects humans have had on Earth's climate. So I want to start with the Earth. So this is actually a famous photo. This was the Apollo 17 photo from 1972. Harrison Schmitt, who was a geologist, on his way to the moon, looked back from 18,000 miles. You have to get out that far to get the whole Earth into a single frame. But there's the Earth. And at this scale, the Earth looks pretty immutable. It doesn't look like something that humans could even monkey with. The only in this picture here, really the only thing that I could find that indicated human interaction is the Suez Canal right up there at the tip of the cursor. Other than that, it kind of looks like the Earth is impervious to human interaction. So the Earth, in terms of geology, it's 4.6 billion years old. That's pretty firm. That's based on the age of the very oldest Earth rocks and moon rocks and meteorites. Humans, on the other hand, as a species, we are 300,000 years old. So if you do the math, it's less than 1/10 of less than 1/100th of 1% of the age of the Earth. So in that perspective, too, it appears that humans aren't all that significant. And then another way to look at humans is in terms of total biomass. This is showing present day biomass. When you look at all the plants and animals on the Earth and in the oceans, it's overwhelmingly plants. It's plant matter, 82%. Another 14% is single cell microbes. Another 2% is fungi. And again, humans are 1/100th of 1% of the total biomass. So again, seemingly insignificant. When you look at geologic time, so this is the 4.6 billion years, and this is something that I always have trouble explaining in class when I'm teaching intro geology. The best analog that I've used is if you think of this, so this is 4.6 billion years ago. This is the creation. Jonathan was just talking about Genesis chapter 1. This is the creation. And this is today. And the scale changes a lot because of the huge numbers. But the best way to think about it analogously is to think of this as a 24-hour day. This is the beginning of the day, and this is midnight. If so, then humans, being 300,000 years old, show up at 11:58, 2 minutes before midnight. That puts it into perspective. And even more startling, if you look at just the last 10,000 years, which is what we consider civilization, the time since we became other than nomads, when agriculture began, that's just the last 5 seconds. So that puts human history into the perspective of Earth history. Some other aspects are that for the first billion years, there was essentially no life. The first life forms we see are very simple blue-green algae 3.5 billion years ago. And then for another almost 3 billion years, there was very little complexity. The complex life forms show up about 600 million years ago. So, Jonathan was just talking about Genesis. That would be essentially day 5, I think, Jonathan, in Genesis, when God created the birds and the fish of the sea. That would be about 600 million years ago in terms of geology, day 5. And then if we expand, since we're human-centric, of course, if we expand to past 7 million years, it looks like this. This is our family. So this is the hominids, which is us, the humans, and our brethren over here, and the great apes, these guys. So that's 7 million years ago. Blowing up just our genus, which is called Homo, that's 2 million years. In the fossil record, the Homo genus shows up 2 million years ago, first in Africa and then elsewhere. And then that genus speciated into 9 species, 9 or 10, depending on who's doing the counting, of which ours is the only one remaining. All the others have gone extinct by natural or other processes. So 300,000 years ago is when our species shows up. So this is 300,000 years. One more expansion that we might want to do is just the last 10,000 years. As I said, what we consider civilization is really the time since we went from being wanderers, nomads, to being agriculturalists. We became sedentary, staying in one place, and that changed everything. So expanding just the last 10,000 years, which, as I said, is the last 5 seconds in the 24-hour day, it looks like this. So there's 2 reasons to illustrate the last 10,000 years. One is agriculture, as I said, and all the things that immediately, at least in a geologic sense, immediately resulted, all these other events. But also there's the fact that this is the time, approximately 10 or 11,000 years ago, when climate ameliorated, when we went from being full glacial 20,000 years ago to fairly rapidly, in terms of geologic time, warming up to the present. So this is the geologic epoch called the Holocene, the last 11,000 years. So those 2 things are not coincidental. The reason agriculture was able to develop is because climate warmed up. All right, so that's a capsule human history and Earth history. One other aspect of factors that have certainly affected climate is this: population. So this is 1,000 years worth of population records. And of course, these are estimates as you get further back in time. But what you see is that we didn't even reach 1 billion until about the time of the Industrial Revolution. So Industrial Revolution was mid 1700s to early 1800s. It's not a fixed point in time, but it's after the invention of the steam engine and the rapid industrialization and the burning of fossil fuels that resulted. So we'll call it 1800. By 1800, we were at 1 billion. And then you can see what the result was: an exponential increase over time, to the point where last year we reached 8.2 billion. And the projection is that by 2050, by mid-century, we'll be at 9.7 billion people. Right. So those 2 factors have resulted in many large-scale changes on the Earth. This is one of them. 70% of the Earth's land surface, exclusive of the ice sheets like Antarctica and Greenland, which is evidently going to become the 51st state, has been altered by humans, and the colors represent the degree of alteration. So there's only a few spots that haven't been affected by the human footprint. Another aspect is the forests. So the original forests that existed at the time of the beginning of agriculture, which is when we started deforestation, are 50% gone. About half of the world's forests have been removed, mainly because of agriculture, but also more recently because of urbanization. The only really extant original forests are in places like the Amazon basin and the Congo basin. All right, so that's an introduction. I want to look more specifically at some of the ways in which we've been accelerating climate change. So I want to start with this. This is, if you haven't seen it, this is really the Class A record of climate. It's the most complete and longest continuous climate record we have. This is from the ice cores in Antarctica, specifically from Vostok, this drilling location here near the South Pole, where for decades, climate scientists have been drilling deep into the ice, going down a couple of miles deep into the ice. So this is today, this is the surface, and this is over a mile deep. The record goes back more than 1 million years. This is 800,000 years worth of climate records. What you see is several interesting things. This is an ice core, by the way. There's a picture of one. And this is a photomicrograph of just 30 centimeters of one. So you can see, number one, annual layers up near the top of the core. You can actually count years. And also these dots that look like dots, they're actually bubbles of atmosphere. So when you know where you are going down with time into the core, you can sample these bits of atmosphere, and you can determine what the atmospheric concentration was at that point in time. But some of the aspects of this record, so this is temperature, in the change from today, difference from today in Antarctica. What you see is several things. One is that in this 800,000 year record, there are 8 cycles of glacial, interglacial. I've marked the most recent 2 interglacials. So these are the warm times in reddish colors, and the cold times, the glacial episodes, are in bluish colors. So you see that there's 8 of them, and that tells you something right away. The cycle is about 100,000 years, and that there's a reason for that, because at least for the past 1.5 million years, our climate has been naturally driven by what's called eccentricity. It's the change in the shape of the Earth's orbit. The orbit goes from kind of rugby ball shape to basketball shape and back again with a 100,000 year cycle. So that's what you're seeing here. One other thing is that when the climate starts to deteriorate, it happens slowly. So this was the last interglacial before the present, called the Sangamon, 120,000 years ago. And when climate started to deteriorate, it's pretty slow, but it gets to its peak, coldest point about 20,000 years ago. And that you can see that same behavior in the previous glacial episodes. But after that, we call this the last glacial maximum. After that, the warming is pretty quick, at least geologically quick. So in about 8,000 or 9,000 years, we went from absolute cold to pretty much where we are today. And this is that homogeneous climate that you saw in the earlier slide, where essentially climate hasn't changed very much, at least not in a natural sense, over that past 10,000 years. All right, so that's the temperature record. And going along with that, as I said, climate scientists can sample these bubbles to get atmospheric concentrations. So here's CO2. And what you see right away is that these go hand in hand. So this is the CO2 record, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in Antarctica. And basically, the reason it goes hand in hand is because this CO2 drives that. This is the major greenhouse gas, and this is the result. High CO2 means warm times, and low CO2, like here, means very cold times. And then if we just isolate the CO2 record, it's the same record from Vostok. What you can see is that during a glacial time, during these times when climate has badly deteriorated, when we're at the peak in the ice age, 8 of them, the CO2 level is about 180 parts per million. Right? We call that the ice age level. It's an average. Whereas during the interglacials, the warm times, like we're in right now, the Holocene, and the previous one, the Sangamon, it's more like 280. So that's the excursion. This is warm to cold, 180 to 280. But look what has happened. You can't see it at this scale, but I'll expand this part in a moment. We'll look at the last 1,000 years. Look what has happened over this period. This is really just the Industrial Revolution. Instead of being where it should be in the natural world, it's now I checked just the other day at Mauna Loa, which is the longest serving CO2 monitoring station, which is being shut down, by the way, by NOAA. It's now at 427 parts per million. So CO2 has risen 50% higher than it should be, higher than it's ever been, in fact, at least during this glacial episode. So expanding the last 1,000 years, here's CO2 at about 280, where it should be during interglacial. Here's us starting to burn coal first, and then petroleum and natural gas. And the result is this big spike in CO2 up to 427 today. Methane, the other big greenhouse gas, which is less abundant, this is parts per billion, whereas this is parts per million, shows the same behavior. Methane has increased more than 100% since the Industrial Revolution. And then expanding just the last couple hundred, or about 300 years almost, you can see two things. Here's the Industrial Revolution and the beginning of the ramping up of carbon dioxide and methane. But you can also see a change in the slope, an increase in the rate starting around the 1950s. And this is mainly because of population increase and increased urbanization after the Second World War. Before we leave the topic of emissions, we should look at this. So this is CO2 emissions for the 9 main emitters. And this goes back to before the Industrial Revolution. So I put this in because you often hear that China is the biggest emitter, and that's only true if you're only looking at annual emissions. Right now, China puts out more emissions per year than the US. That's mainly because China has 4 times as many people. But over time, if you accumulate the emissions, the US has by far put more CO2 into the atmosphere than China has. 25% of all the CO2 that went into the atmosphere is from us, from our burning of fossil fuels and all of our automobiles, et cetera. China accounts for 15%. So these two countries are almost half, and then the other 7 are almost all the rest. So that's the emissions. And then moving to temperature, this is the temperature record. So a similar record, this is 2,000 years of temperature. And you can see this, again, this is from the ice cores in blue. Essentially no change. So this is temperature change going back to the year 0. If anything, temperature dipped a little bit. This is what's called the Little Ice Age. It was a little dip. Temperatures worldwide dipped by a few tenths of a degree. And then you get to the Industrial Revolution, and again, that same record is obvious. This is that 1.5 degree Celsius rise that we've experienced primarily, almost overwhelmingly, due to fossil fuel burning since the Industrial Revolution began. And if we expand just the last less than 200 years, you can see it more clearly. So here's that 1.5 degree rise total, mostly since the beginning of the 20th century. So this is fossil fuel burning. And one carry-on effect of the warming of the atmosphere is the warming of the oceans because they're in direct contact. So this is sea surface temperatures going back as far as we have sea surface temperature measurements, which is about 1880. So this is the upper 200 meters of the ocean. And what it shows also is a rise, not quite as much as the air has risen, but about 1.3 degrees Celsius, which is 2.3 degrees Fahrenheit, since about 1880. The reason for mentioning that is because, and this relates directly to Western North Carolina, is because sea surface temperature is what drives storms. So the more energy, the more temperature, and therefore the more energy in the surface of the ocean, the more, not the more storms, we haven't been seeing more frequent storms, but it means the more of the big storms, the category 3, 4, 5, they're getting bigger and bigger, and that is documented. So what this is a plot from NOAA of billion-dollar storm events, that is single events that have cost more than $1 billion or more. And you can see in the 80s and 90s, there isn't much change. It's been $1 or $2 billion events. But then again, there's a spike upwards as the sea surface, as the sea has taken in more and more energy, become more energetic, and the storms have gotten bigger. So this is, what it's saying is that we've had $22 billion storm events last year in 2025. And here in North Carolina, we're familiar with this one. So this one, which is 17 events, $17 billion events in 2024, this includes Helene. And what it doesn't show is how big Helene was. Helene was one of the biggest and most expensive ever. Helene cost $79 billion in losses, of which 60 billion was in North Carolina. And then another factor is sea level rise. So the warming of the oceans has resulted in a rise in sea level because water expands when it's warm. And also at the same time, the glaciers, the ice sheets are still undergoing melting. So this is in terms of sea level rise rate in millimeters per year, going back 2,000 years. This is the year zero. Very little change in the record until about the Industrial Revolution time. And then again, just like you've seen with temperature and the CO2, sea level rise, the rate of sea level rise has spiked upwards since the Industrial Revolution. So there's a reason for all this. One other aspect of sea level is during the instrumental record, where we've actually measured sea level. So this is a compilation of all the global tide gauge records in blue. So this goes back to 1700, prior to the Industrial Revolution. I've marked the Industrial Revolution, and you can see the curve starting to move upward since then. So this is global sea level averaged rising, and this is the absolute level of sea level. This isn't a rate on the y-axis. And the green represents satellite records, which started in 1993, which corroborate the tide gauge records. One final thing that's been added here is projections out to 2100. So this is kind of best case and worst case. Either case is, excuse me, not very good. Some of the worst case estimates from the global climate models is that sea level might rise 1.5 meters by 2100 because of warming. One aspect of both the combination of warming and the surface oceans rising is this. So in Western Antarctica, so this is West Antarctica. Up here is the Antarctic Peninsula, and Patagonia, South America, would be over there. So these parts of West Antarctica are grounded ice shelves. So these are tongues of the West Antarctic ice sheet that are grounded on the continental shelf. They're not contributing to sea level. So this is frozen water that's sitting on the shelf. But what's happening with them, because of the heating up of the surface oceans, they're being undermined by that warming ocean. And they're also being lifted up by sea level rise every year. And as a result, these that are in the darker colors, the reddish and purple colors, are surging. That is, they're moving seaward as much as 2 kilometers per year. And glaciologists are especially concerned about several of these, and especially this one. It's called Thwaites, this one. If just this single one were to just peel off, deteriorate, go seaward, whether it melts or not, if that ice ends up in the ocean, it raises sea level 3 meters, which is 10 feet. If you want to see what 10 feet looks like, this is say Louisiana losing 20% of its land area. Same thing for Florida. Virtually all of South Florida goes underwater. And even North Carolina doesn't do very well. So this is the 10-meter contour in the colors for North Carolina. North Carolina would lose about 10%, about 10,000 square miles. One final aspect that I'd like to point at is in terms of extinctions. So again, from a geologic point of view, geologists talk about the 5 mass extinctions. A mass extinction is defined as a loss of 50% or more of the extant life on Earth, and that has happened 5 times in the fossil record. The worst was in the Permian 252 million years ago, when 90% of all living things, plants and animals, died out. It was almost a total extinction event. The one we're all familiar with probably is the Cretaceous, when a meteorite was responsible for changing climate for quite a number of years, many centuries. And as a result, the big predators died out. That was the death of the dinosaurs. So that's the geologic record. But the biologic record says, the biologists have told us that we're in the midst, probably in the 6th mass extinction. And the evidence, the kind of evidence they presented, is something like this. So this is the background level of extinctions, just the normal rate at which species go extinct in the dotted line. And what they've found, going back to the 16th century, is that starting around the time of the Industrial Revolution, again here, vertebrate extinction rates for these families of vertebrates, like the mammals and the birds, have increased as much as 50 times over background rates. So with all that good news, I'd like to get a little bit more positive and look at what we can do and how some of us, many of our institutions have responded to global warming. Excuse me. So I hesitated to put this in. I actually had it a lot more detailed. There were about 20 or more items. This has to do with what the federal government has been doing since last January. And it's really sad. For most of the past couple of decades, the federal government has been leading the charge in mitigating climate change. That all changed in January. The worst things are these two. That is, we have withdrawn from all the major global climate treaties. We're the only country that has, and specifically from the 2015 Paris Agreement. So all the countries of the world signed on, including the U.S., to these treaties, starting with 1992 with the framework. The U.S. is the only one that has pulled out. That's unfortunate because, as you saw, we are the biggest emitter. So we're not getting much help from the federal government, and that's probably going to be true for the next 3 years. But barring that, many lower-level governments, as you'll see, as I'll show, and other agencies and individuals are doing their share. For instance, in 5 years ago, these 11 UMC agencies put out a pledge, basically in support of the Paris Agreement in 2015. The Paris Agreement said we will do our best to limit our emissions to a level which results in warming of 2 degrees by 2100 and preferably 1.5 degrees. 1.5 degrees is the level above which climate scientists say we could have catastrophic climate change. So these 11 agencies committed to net zero greenhouse emissions by 2050, which is considered what the next step has to be in order to reach 1.5 degrees or at least 2.0 degrees by 2100. And then more recently, at the General Conference in Charlotte in 24, there were several resolutions, including some that our committee and Jonathan and Kim were involved in, put forth, which were passed and have become part of the Book of Discipline, among others, to develop a plan and a schedule for net zero greenhouse gas emissions for church facilities by 2050, to advocate for greenhouse gas reduction and global climate action, both within and without the denomination, and to conduct annual carbon footprints and emissions audits of church facilities, and to establish green teams within each facility, each congregation. And then more recently, the creation justice movement, of which several of our committee are involved in as well, have advocated, this was in September, have advocated reducing carbon emissions within the denomination, forming green teams, creating creation justice coordinators in each conference, encouraging solar panels, which is something we've been working on, and divesting within the denomination from fossil fuels. Then more recently, the Council of Bishops put out a statement, and this was it, basically joining the United Methodist Agencies in committing to net zero greenhouse emissions, implementing sustainable practices in managing church properties, creating green teams, and establishing caretakers of God's creation, of which Jonathan is the one for this conference. Finally, a couple of examples of government agencies other than the federal government being involved. This is the Climate Action Plan Network. It's 100 major cities worldwide, of which about 12 are in the US. And basically these are cities that have committed to adhering to the 2015 Paris Agreement. Same thing for the Climate Alliance. So these East Coast and West Coast, mainly states, including North Carolina, have joined the Climate Alliance. This represents 55% of the population and 60% of the economy, with the same goal to achieve net zero by mid-century. Finally, my final slide is really, this is the market speaking. This is the solar market. So solar photovoltaic additions to the grid is what this is about. So this is terawatts of new solar photovoltaic cells like this being added to the grid. Going back to the beginning, the first photo cell, 1954, and up to 2022, there was a total of 1.2 terawatts. A terawatt is a trillion watts. Each a trillion watt is equivalent to 1,000 major power plants, each of those capable of serving 700,000 people. So it's a lot of energy. That took 68 years. It took 2 years to get to 2.2. So the second terawatt only took 2 years. And that's because solar is the cheapest and the fastest type of electric power for utilities to install. And utilities realize that. So this is the market speaking. In the US, solar accounted for 64% of all new electric generating capacity last year, and solar, wind, and batteries accounted for 92%. So renewables now worldwide have surpassed coal as the largest global electricity source. So there is light at the end of the tunnel, and it's probably LEDs powered by solar panels. Thank you. I'll unshare.
Thank you, Joe, for sharing with us. That's a lot of information, and we're just so thankful to you for being able to bring that and put it into some images that might make sense to us, or at least help us start to see the extent of the reality we're facing. We're going to take what Joe has presented to us and bring it right here on the ground, if you will, with Maggie Armstrong. Maggie comes to us from also a scientific background and understanding of the things that Joe was talking about and trying to make sense with us. And she is now working on staff with the Western North Carolina Conference in Disaster Response Ministries, a part of our wonderful team that's working in Helene recovery. And she has been watching and seeing with her own eyes some of the realities that are upon us because of climate change. So I'm going to turn it over to Maggie and let her share with us, what are we witnessing? What are we seeing right now as a result of what Joe has laid out for us? Maggie?
Hey, hi everybody. Again, I'm Maggie, Director of Recovery. I want to start with a little bit of my academic background because I think it complements Joe's really well. So my master's is in the geography of environmental risk and human security. The sentence that Jonathan said at the intro, which was, "How has humanity taken care of God's creation?" I think is a fun one for me, because basically what my studies did was they looked at the intersection of humanity and the environment, right? So we take care of the environment, but also we live in the environment. And so the ways that we're affected by it, it's all a loop. It's all a loop. So I'm going to talk about, I think one of my focuses is going to be on this idea that things have started moving at such an immense pace that they are, with climate change, that now things are really unpredictable. And I'm gonna have a slideshow. It's very basic, and it starts unnecessarily dramatically. I warned you, it was dramatic. I think my point with this is essentially that for a long time we've had places that everyone knew were at risk for climate change. You have places like Louisiana, Florida, Bangladesh, all over the world that are coastal, that are low-lying, that experience typhoons and hurricanes, that experience earthquakes. And there were other places that were climate havens that were safe, where you could go and you could not have to worry about a tropical storm or a hurricane or a tornado. All of those things are shifting in different ways. Tornado Alley is moving because of the ways that air temperatures are shifting globally. And one of the things that rings very true with Hurricane Helene is that Western North Carolina was always considered a space that is safe. A lot of people move here from Florida. Everyone knows that. So that they can get part of that is to get away from some of the climate insecurities that you have in low-lying coastal areas. And we had one of the most expensive and destructive storms that has ever hit the United States land in the mountains, 10 hours away from the coastline where it made landfall. So then the next question is, what do we do with that information? And I'm going to start by talking about a town in Buncombe County called Barnardsville. It is about 40 minutes north. It's in the county of Asheville, and it is a whole different universe. It's a small town, rural, agricultural, and it has one of the oldest homes or structures, I forget, in Buncombe County that until Hurricane Helene had never flooded. This is a picture of a creek in Barnardsville. You might notice that it is shallow, that it is not particularly tumultuous. There are much smaller creeks like this that exist all over that town. And we have a staff that works in that area. I could have told the story about 87 places in Western North Carolina. I just happened to spend a lot of time here last December, and I think it's a good example. In Barnardsville, there's a road that on the other, like behind homes, has a creek, and the creek is about 2 feet wide. And during the storm, during Hurricane Helene, that creek grew to be large enough to take barns and homes down the street. So here are some pictures of this town and that same water that we just looked at in the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Helene. So a creek that was about 2 feet wide. I worked with a client who has an equine therapy farm that she uses for people with disabilities and with mental illnesses for rehabilitation and therapy. Her neighbor's barn drifted onto her property from this 2-foot storm and exploded. And her entire property was covered with trash from her neighbor's barn. Her livelihood as an equine therapist was really threatened because while her horses all survived, none of her structures did, and she didn't have safe grazing land for her horses. So that's that thing of we live in the environment that really matters. But again, oldest house in Buncombe County had never flooded. You can see there's a bunch of rubble, there's a bunch of mud everywhere, and you can still drive through that community and see if you're ever driving in an area that was hit by Hurricane Helene. First of all, try to avoid disaster tourism. Doesn't make people feel good. But if you ever happen to be on a road that was hit really hard and you see piles of rock, one thing you can look at, and Joe might be able to speak to this more because I am a geographer, not a geologist, but there are huge river rock deposits that are the size of single wide trailers in small towns like Barnardsville. And you can tell that those rocks did not used to be there because they are smooth. They used to be sitting at the bottom of a river. And when the river grew into, or when the stream grew into a rushing river, it deposited river rock onto land. And that rock is now a fixture of those communities. And that is, when you talk about the scale of Earth and climate changing, that happened in a day. And it will be like that for the rest of my life. So now back to academia, which I know is what everyone's here for. One of the most useful things I learned in my master's degree was from a report, called the International Panel on Climate Change. It is essentially like a body of scientists. How do I explain it? It's a 10,000 page document that synthesizes all climate science done all over the world. There is a body of scientists who work as volunteers to vet that. And one part of climate science is also climate risk assessment and climate risk reduction. And that's really what my studies focused on. And the most important thing I learned in my master's program was this little Venn diagram, which conceives of climate risk as the intersection of hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. So hazards are the thing. They're the tornadoes, they're the hurricanes. Exposure is your home, is your employer, is your physical body, is your community in the area where the storm hit or where the event happened, right? How close is your home to the river? How low lying is your home? That is an exposure. And then vulnerability brings in this socioeconomic processes. So what are some of the things that keep you from power and wealth and resources that would allow you, one, to prepare yourself and to prevent exposure to storms, but two, to recover if something happens. So in disaster ministries, the population that we work with is largely disenfranchised in some form or fashion. Sometimes it is due to poverty, sometimes it is due to disability, sometimes it is due to marginalization based on race, based on other kinds of statuses. And those things just make it harder for you to get ready, and it makes it harder for you to bounce back. And so in a world where things seem to be getting worse, this model is kind of created for how do we reduce climate risk? If we reduce vulnerability, if we give people socioeconomic resources, if we reduce exposure, if we move populations away from some of these high-risk areas, if we reduce hazard by tackling climate change, then risk grows smaller. And in a reality where climate change is happening and exposure, the areas where people are exposed are getting more wide-reaching, are reaching into small towns in Appalachia for a hurricane. In a world where hazards are getting more extreme, where tornadoes and hurricanes and floods are larger than they've ever been and more expensive than they've ever been, and in a political reality where the wealth inequality is growing, what that means is that in our reality, in the American context, my opinion is that climate risk is growing. And so one of the things that I think is really important is that I think we can learn a lot from the way that Hurricane Helene impacted Western North Carolina, a place where this doesn't happen, a place where we didn't have a culture of preparedness. I used to live in Florida. I used to work for the Florida Conference in Disaster Recovery. And while I'm so happy to be back home in Western North Carolina, one thing I loved about Florida is that there was a real culture of preparedness. A storm is coming. Everybody's looking. Everybody's thinking. Everybody knows how to read storm maps. Everybody understands what to do and how to be safe. And so I think the question that I started with is nowhere is safe. What do we do? We accept that reality and we try to build up our communities. We try to build up our resources and we try to make people safe and aware so that they're ready for the next thing. All right. Thanks.
Thank you, Maggie, for helping to bring that home right here in our own Western North Carolina conference. We've learned a lot today. We're going to have more in the future. I want to make you aware of the opportunities we have ahead of us, and then those who can stick around, we would love to share with any questions or thoughts that came up during the presentation. But first of all, we want to make sure that you mark your calendar for Saturday, April 18th. We're going to be offering a one-day Bishops Climate Summit for such a time as this. This being what we just learned about, what we're learning more about. What is going on in our world today that the church needs to be aware of so we can respond to that. The official registration is coming up soon, so if you would like to be one of the first to learn about that, use your phone camera and take a picture of that or scan the QR code there, and we will it'll take you to a page where you can let us know that you want to know and be one of the first when the registration opens. We are offering some discounts to this event for churches that bring 5 or more from the same church and for students who are going to be coming and being a part of that day as well. Before then, though, we're going, well, at the summit, let me just say, we'll also have another couple of workshops with more time to go into some depth of some of what you saw today. But Dr. Donahue is going to be looking at improving your energy efficiency for your church buildings. So if your church is looking at how can we reduce the cost of electricity, but even more important, the greenhouse gas effects, then that's an opportunity for you. And Maggie will be co-presenting how our disaster response is shifting and changing and growing in this time of climate change. So that's coming up at the summit itself. And then before then, we're going to have two more webinars. The next one will be February 12th, same time, and it'll be about our warming oceans. So we're going to look at what the impact has been of climate change on the oceans and how that is then impacting us directly or indirectly. That touches on your ministry, probably in ways that you didn't realize already. And then in March, we're going to have the third webinar, which will be Where is Hot Too Hot for Humans? And what are we doing to ourselves and to our world as those temperatures keep going up, as you saw in the graphs? What impact will that have on us? And so you can scan that QR code and make sure you're signed up for the webinars and the event itself when we do the Climate Summit on April the 18th. And then finally, thank you for being with us for this webinar brought to you by the Creation Care Ministry of your Western North Carolina Conference. If you've got questions or comments or anything that you would like to ask us in the future, make sure you copy down our email address, creationcarewncc@gmail.com. You see it there, creationcarewncc@gmail.com. And you'll find some links in the chat as well to these activities coming up. But we appreciate you coming and being with us today for this presentation. And if you've got some time, you'd like to stick around and ask some questions directly to our presenters, we will be here for a few more minutes and would love to help make better sense of all that's going on. So thank you all for being here, and thank you, presenters, for what you have brought to us today, Joe and Maggie. All right, so I'm looking at our chat, trying to see, I didn't see many questions as we were going through, but if you've got a question and you would like to ask it, the easiest thing with a group this size would be to go to the bottom of your Zoom screen there and click where it says react and click where it says raise hand. It'll pop you up at the top and we can see who has a question, and we'll let you ask that directly at this time. So raise your hand there in the Zoom and we'll see what questions you have or what comments or thoughts, connections you're making. Maybe your church is doing something that is in response, or you'd like to do something in response to this reality of climate change. And you've got questions about those as well, but primarily for what our presenters have presented today.
Could you show the website again?
Sure, the website for the events coming up.
Yes.
All right, let's see.
Or Creation Care at.
Oh, yes, Creation Care WNCC@gmail.com
Okay,
is our
thanks.
email address.
Thanks.
Yes. Rodney, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, all great information, some of which I was familiar with, some of which I was not. I'm wondering if we're going to engage in a process of figuring out what to tell the larger congregations at our churches. They can't all sit through 3 hours of presentations, and just trying to figure out what should we prioritize out of these presentations today and out of the future presentations.
Mm-hmm. You put your finger on one of the big challenges that we're facing is there's so much information, so much need to understand that, but getting an audience to listen long enough to dig in deep enough to make sense of it is a challenge that we face. And so one of the things that I've learned through years of doing Creation Care ministry in lots of churches is to start with tying the realities we're living with back into our scriptures because people are turned, or not turned off, but people's eyes glaze over when you bring in a lot of science and things like that, because they feel like, well, what's that got to do with the church? Well, what it has to do with the church is that God has called us to be about this ministry. And we need to see that and understand that and begin to figure out, how do we own our responsibility to tend to take care of God's earth, to watch over it, and to make sure that this system that God created to be not only self-healing, but also healing of the creatures and the life forms on the planet. If we can help it stay whole and healed, then it can help us stay whole and healed. And so it's a symbiotic relationship between humans and the earth. And so often in the church, we've disconnected humanity from all the rest of God's creation. There's been this long-standing understanding that humanity somehow was the last thing created by God to rule over, to dominate, to take dominion, to own, to use up, to do whatever we wanted to with it. And we've broken down the system that really allows life to go on with strength. And so I say, start with the theology. At the Bishops' Climate Summit, we'll have at least one workshop that's focusing on the theology, the biblical understanding behind what all we're talking about. And it's designed to help with that beginning of the conversation. There'll be other resources available that will be at that Climate Summit, from books and articles to video resources and things that can be used. And we're going to try to put those, at least a list of those resources, and help you know where to find them so that you can do future activities in your church, how to tie some of it into worship, but also maybe some special studies, or where in the community you can take a team or a group and go learn more. Does that help answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Sure. Let's see, Joni's got your hand up. Joni, will you unmute there so we can hear you?
Okay.
It came off of mute and went right back on. Make sure you only click one time on that button.
Okay.
Yes, there you are. Now speak.
Sorry. The part that Joe Donahue gave with all the charts, is that going to be available in some sort of video that we could bring to a Sunday school class or a meeting or whatever? That's my question.
Yes, great question. So we are recording this webinar, and it will be available very soon on the conference website. And you can use that to send the link to others to watch it, to show it in your Sunday school class, to make it available to others. And you can pause it and look at those charts as long as you like to, and make sense of them along the way. Would that be helpful?
Yes, I think that's wonderful. Thank you very much.
Sure. Someone else.
Jonathan, I can also, for anybody that wants it, I can send them the PowerPoint if they want to actually give a PowerPoint presentation.
Thanks, Joe. So if you just reach out to the Creation Care WNCC@gmail.com and ask for that presentation, we can get it to you.
Thank you.
What else are you thinking about or wondering about that you'd like for us to respond to at this point? Or Joe or Maggie, if there's anything you left out of your presentation because of time and you're thinking that would be helpful, you can perhaps share that. I see Margaret's got your hand up. Margaret, will you share?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I really appreciate the Venn diagram that Maggie showed, because it emphasizes, there's the climate change, the root causes of the suffering that we're bringing on ourselves. And then there's also the adaptive processes and opportunities that we have to minimize the human suffering, right? We're never going to eliminate it because the hazards are getting bigger and bigger and bigger much faster than we can mitigate that via those, exposure reduction and vulnerability reduction. So it's a really good way, I think, to think about that. I think the church needs to be about all three of those things, right? It's, there's the human aspects of it are really important. And so, as Maggie said, like there are opportunities to minimize exposures and minimize the vulnerability of certain groups of folks. But ultimately, that's never going to be the solution because the hazards are growing faster than either of those types of adaptive activities that we can do. So I think it's a really good way to think about it. The church, I think, needs to be about all three as we seek to, be obedient in terms of both caring for God's creation, the first commandment that you referred to in Genesis, as well as caring for our neighbors.
Thanks for that, Margaret. You're very right. We're struggling with so many of those things. And at the Bishop's Climate Summit, we'll have at least 2 workshops, one looking at how churches can become heat resiliency centers across our conference for the growing heat and the ways that it relates to human health. And also another workshop that Maggie and Brian Mateer, who's on the call with us here with our conference disaster response, are going to be talking about what are we doing differently, or how are we trying to change what we're doing in our disaster response ministries to do some of that preparation ahead of time, to get ahead of the next disaster. So those are part of those. And then we've got a couple of workshops that are looking at what can we do to do our part to try to slow down that steep curve that we saw on those graphs of the CO2 and the methane and the heat gases. And so we're trying to help see all the different aspects of that. But you're right. I love that diagram that Maggie shared. It really is helpful to visualize and understand it's not just something out of our hands. There's a lot that we do and we've been doing and we can do differently to make a difference there.
I also want to address, I saw a question in the comment that said, how do we address the naysayers? I have a couple of strategies. They're different depending on what scenarios you're in. One is that I spend a lot of time in people's homes, and I spend a lot of time in Western North Carolina, and also when I was in Florida, I've spent a lot of time in communities that did not particularly believe in climate change. Because I work on the back end of climate change, I work on the bad thing happened. What do we do? What do we do now? I usually start with, y'all, it's hot. It's hot and it's getting worse and people love complaining. So starting with, there are some realities that are unavoidable and moving in towards those, meeting people where they are, and where they are is they know that it's hotter and they know that it's colder. And they know that it's more expensive and they know that they feel less safe. That's one thing. And then I think another thing is, especially with so that's like a general world population. I think when you are working in the church, centering it as a people care issue, right? Unstable climates and unstable environments make for unstable lives and unsafe people.
That's a great way of putting it. Thanks, Maggie. Ray, you got your hand up.
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank you all for the presentation. And just background from my perspective, I'm a retired climate scientist. I worked for the Air Force at the federal building here in Asheville, and was colleagues with my friends over at NCEI on the other side of the house. And this was the last 10, 15 years of my life in one way or another. To respond a little bit to the last thing, I heard Catherine Hayhoe speak many times in some of her information and addressing the naysayers. And the reality is the hard naysayers are less than 10%, but they're the loudest. But what Maggie was saying was exactly right. Meet them where they are. But I do want to comment that even if we are successful in mitigating, and Maggie was correct on this, if you remember the climate chart that Joe showed, even in the best case scenarios where we level off carbon dioxide and methane stuff now, the residual is just going to keep rising and be part. So mitigation is important, but probably adaptation type strategies especially for the vulnerable is important. And it's just not the hurricanes. The warming of the atmosphere means there's a whole lot more moisture, and it doesn't just mean the hurricanes are kicking it off. Flooding from heavy systems, even in the wintertime, as well as thunderstorms in the summer. It's going to explode. And so what we saw here in Asheville area, even though we've seen it on kind of a 20-year cycle, I expect it to increase in time and cover more area, just like it's done. But appreciate it. Joe, you're just down the road from me. At some point, I'd like to link up with you and talk. I'm at Givens Estates right now, so love to get up with you and talk some more, and like to get in touch with you all as well. Thanks.
That'd be great, Ray. I get what you're saying about adaptation. I think Maggie and I would both call ourselves climate migrants. My wife and I moved here from Florida, also from Orlando, in large part because it was just getting unbearably hot in the summer.
Right.
Every summer it was hotter and hotter. But yeah, that's something that we're all going to have to deal with. That and you're right. I mean, CO2 is up there, and it's going to be up there for possibly thousands of years, according to the models. So something in addition to mitigation is going to have to happen. Possibly we're going to have to find some cost-effective way to extract CO2 from the atmosphere, carbon sequestration. It isn't there yet, but that's probably what's going to happen.
I would love to hear if any of you who are climate focused folks and study this. I saw a report that got very little traction in the news from my algorithm, which is pretty heavily involved with some of this climate adaptation or risk actions and things, was saying that this past hurricane season in 2025, we all heard about the very large, powerful storm that hit Jamaica, but then immediately bent and went back out into the ocean, which typically we would see that come on shore in the US. There was a weather system that sort of set up along the kind of the East Coast, and it kept pushing the storms back out to sea. So we didn't have the landfalls like we would typically have. So what a lot of people don't realize, and I didn't understand this was going on, was that we had, I believe it was 5 Category 5 storms, which is the most storms of that size we've ever had in measurable history in the Atlantic Basin. Can anyone speak to what that might portend for our future, as the weather system is not going to always set up and push them back out to sea? So what's going to happen when we start to see those coming in one after another?
I can tell you that I wasn't watching, I'm not a tropical expert, but the amount of major storms was very high. They just didn't hit the landfall, and we were fortunate for that, unless you were in Jamaica. But that's the scenarios we're going to keep seeing. The amount of hurricanes and the amount of major hurricanes, the risk from those is going to increase, and the effects. That's just over the last 12 years or so, it's gone from a low to confidence to a moderate, and now pretty much a high confidence from the climate scientists. So
I would also remind people that the United States is only one of the places in the world. So if you ever hear the word typhoon just means a hurricane that happened somewhere else. It's just a hurricane that started in a different ocean and moved in a different direction. Indonesia and Sri Lanka had some of the worst impacts that the world has ever seen due to a typhoon this year. So keeping that in mind, that we got lucky for a year in the US, but the world did not overall maintain that luckiness.
All right, I see Rodney, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, in line with what Ray and Joe were saying about heating, there's a map that predicts the number of days when heat will be in the danger zone in the year 2100, which sounds far away. Now I won't see it, but it's closer than you think, and it shows you the trends. Now, Florida and Georgia, they're going to have massive parts of the year where people can't survive outside. You can't sweat. Your sweat won't be effective at cooling you. Anyway, getting back to North Carolina, we're predicted to have more than those kind of days where the heat is in the danger zone. So I could share that with Jonathan and anyone else who's interested.
Sure. That'll be helpful to see some of that. And again, at our Bishop's Climate Summit, one of those workshops will be about heat resiliency. And we have a professor coming from Duke University who works in that very purpose, heat resiliency, with churches in helping us prepare ourselves ahead of time, getting ready to be somewhere that people can come to when the power grid goes down, when the heat is, as Rodney was just describing, when it's too hot for us to cool off. And one of the things that most people don't realize is it's not getting cold enough at night for our body to reset, to stay healthy. So it stays so hot at night that our body can't physically rest enough to be ready for the next day. And that's just a cumulative effect on the breakdown of our body systems. And so how can the church be ready and prepare ourselves now in the next few years for, as this continues to increase in heat issues through more and more days over, and depending on where you live, they got different ways to scale that. But basically, if you ever hear of a wet bulb measurement, that's talking about the point at which it becomes too difficult for us to survive in that place in that time without being air conditioned and without having a place to get away from the effects of that heat. So how do our churches prepare for that? You can learn about that on August 18th. On May 18th. April 18th. What am I talking about? I got too many dates in my mind. Whatever was on the screen earlier, April 18th, that's it. All right. Anything else? Well, two of my partners who are really helping to put together these events for the year, including the webinars and the Bishop's Climate Summit, are Kim Richmond and Brian Mateer. You'll see them here on the screen. Margaret Miller, you heard from a few moments ago. She will be presenting at our next webinar coming up on February the 12th. Did I say it right? And so we hope, I know most of you have signed up for all three of the webinars, so you'll get another email a couple of days before and the day of to remind you that's coming up, and share with others about what we're doing and their opportunities to come and watch and hear and learn. And then we'll begin to put together, how do we actually respond and react in ways that are loving God and loving God's creation, because we are integrally connected with one another. And as the health of the planet goes, so the health of humanity goes. We know that. We just, as people of faith, have a great opportunity to make a difference in this world and with God's creation. So we want to encourage you to be a part of what's coming up and share the news with others. Thanks for being here today, everyone.